This lecture will cover cognitive development in infancy. The image on your left shows a game of peekaboo being played between an adult and an infant. Part of this lecture will discuss why peekaboo can be such a stimulating and fascinating experience for infants. We'll begin with discussing Piaget's cognitive development theory, specifically his first stage, the sensory motor period, which lasts the first 2 years of life. We will then discuss cognitive development from an information processing perspective. We'll be discussing the concepts of attention and memory as they develop during infancy. And lastly, we'll discuss language development. We'll discuss some of the natural influences of language as well as some of the general developments associated with language during the first 2 years of life. So, Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development was discussed in the first chapter of this course. However, when it was presented, it was discussed or described in 4 different stages of cognitive development, with each stage containing certain milestones or developments, as well as certain limitations of cognitive development throughout the lifespan, leading into adolescence. The other side of Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development describes cognitive development in a more continuous fashion, without descriptions of specific age-related developments. So Jean Piaget, in addition to those stages, describes cognitive development in terms of the development of schemes or schemas. Sometimes the second E is replaced with an A. And so schemes or schemas are these organized sets of knowledge or information that essentially guide all aspects of our psychology, our behavior, and our mental processes. One can think of schemes as a web of ideas, for example. So as we go through life, we have these schemes or these organized sets of knowledge or frameworks of knowledge, pieces of information that we use to not only understand the world around us and understand new experiences, but in turn, those experiences also reshape the way that we think and we understand the world. These 2 processes are known as assimilation and accommodation. So, to give you an example of assimilation, think of a baby who knows the concept of a bird, or perhaps the word birdie is more appropriate for a baby. And so a young child around 2 years of age might know that a bird is something that flies and has wings. They probably don't know that birds are cold-blooded and that birds lay eggs. Those are things that we learn later about birds, and those new pieces of information that we learn about birds, they become part of our scheme or our framework of birds through the process of accommodation. Now think about the first time that a 2-year-old might see a plane in the sky. Now a 2-year-old doesn't know what this 2-year-old in an example might not know what a plane is, but this stimulus, this image of a plane, might fit the description or the scheme that exists in the child's mind because it flies and it has wings. And so in theory, it's likely that a child might point up at the sky and see a plane and call it a birdie or a bird. And so they are having this new experience. They've never seen a plane before. And so what they are doing is, from a cognitive perspective, they are reaching into their toolbox, if you will, of all of the schemes that they have, because we have schemes for everything. We have schemes for birds. We have schemes for food. We have schemes for psychology. We have schemes for video games. We have schemes for drugs, movies, anything, any sort of idea that exists in our mind. It can become as elaborate as we allow it to, and at the same time we use these schemes to understand new experiences that we've never had before. And so, for example, another common example of assimilation for babies is that they might refer to other women besides their mom as mama. They might call an older sister mama, or they might call an aunt mama, because what they see are all of these people who take care of them, and these people, they share very similar characteristics in that they're feminine and they have long hair, and so they might refer to them as mama. Or maybe think of someone who's never seen a horse before. They might refer to it as a big dog. Again, they're using what they know to understand this new experience. But of course, as we learn more about them as we read more books and watch more TV shows and have more conversations and take more classes. We learn more about concepts, and therefore those experiences change or modify our schemes. It adds to them, it refines them, makes them more complex. That process is known as accommodation. And what I want to reiterate is that these are continuous examples of development. They are constantly happening. Now, the other side of Piaget's theory describes cognitive development from a discontinuous standpoint, basically saying that we have these four different age-specific stages, which there are specific developments that occur. His first stage is known as the sensory motor period. The reason why it's referred to as the sensory motor period is because he believes that sensory stimulation and basically interaction with the physical world drive cognitive development, which that's where the motor part comes from. This is typically the first 2 years of life, and so it's important to understand that the only way that babies can receive stimulation towards a cognitive stimulation is through sensory stimulation and manipulation with physical objects in the environment. So an adult, for example, can be given a book that only has black and white text, has no pictures, makes no sounds, produces no smells, and is just words. And so they can receive a lot of cognitive stimulation because all of these words have ideas that are attached to them which they've developed over the course of their lifespan. Babies do not have this ability, and so therefore you cannot give a baby a book and expect them to experience cognitive development. Now, we can read to a baby, and we can talk to a baby, and we can sing words to a baby and provide them with auditory stimulation with different pitches and different sounds, and that can provide cognitive development for them because their cognitive development is driven solely on sensory stimulation. If you think about toys that are given to children around the age of 1 to 2, typically these toys are very bright colored. They make sounds. They are able to be physically manipulated, and all of this is basically driving sensory stimulation. So it's basically things that they can see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. And when I say taste and smell, it's important to understand that many of these toys are meant to be big enough so that way they can just kind of put them in their mouth without actually choking on them. And so going back to Freud's oral stage, it's important to understand that, we cannot give small things to children because they will put them in their mouth and they could be a choking hazard. So typically toys for children or for babies around the age of 1 to 2 are often big enough so that way they cannot be lodged in their mouth and their throat. But they are, like I said, they're typically bright colored and they make sounds and they are soft to the touch and smooth, and so that way they can grab them and play with them and manipulate them. The major accomplishment of this period is known as object permanence, and that is the understanding that objects in the physical world continue to exist even if they are not currently sensed. So going back to the game of peekaboo, when we are engaging in eye-to-eye contact with a child and then we cover our face and then we reappear suddenly, it's a very stimulating experience for babies because they have not developed object permanence and they don't understand that behind your hands your face continues to exist. They still have not grasped that basic concept of how physics works. And of course they gain a quick understanding of that by the second year of life, and that's why peekaboo after the second year of life is very rarely, if ever, stimulating to a human. But that is the idea of the sensory motor period, being able to understand that even though we cannot see something, we can no longer see it, it still continues to exist. Cognitive development can be explained in a wide range of perspectives. We looked at Jean Piaget's cognitive development theory, and now we're going to look at cognitive development from an information processing perspective. Information processing perspective does not have any age-specific developments. It's mostly an example of continuous development of specific skills and cognitive abilities, such as attention. Attention abilities will increase throughout infancy gradually, slowly, cumulatively. Selective attention begins around 4 months. You may remember from the physical development PowerPoint when we were talking about sleep patterns in infancy. And basically during the first 4 months of life, babies are constantly drifting in and out of consciousness, and so they don't really have the attentive ability to focus on anything or much of anything, especially not for an extended extended period of time. But around the age of 4 months, babies will begin to learn to focus their attention on a human or an object that's moving around. We talked about the concept of habituation. Remember that habituation means that we tend to basically learn to ignore repetitive or unchanging stimuli. We learn the ability to drown out a repetitive or unchanging visual stimulus in our environment or an auditory stimulus in our environment, and that allows us to focus on things that are changing that can have some meaningful value to us. Now, memory formations also begin early in life. However, it's important to differentiate between the concept of implicit versus explicit memories. So implicit memories often involve skills and procedures that are motor function based. And so this implies basically muscle memory, if you will. Learning how to crawl and learning how to walk, there's muscles associated with that. There's muscle memory associated with that, and those are implicit memories. And so therefore they don't require a whole lot of cognitive effort. That's why we can walk and talk at the same time. We can walk and think at the same time. We don't need to, or we can type and talk at the same time. We can play video games and talk at the same time, because a lot of those movements that are associated with playing video games or typing or texting or walking have become implicit. They involve skills and procedures that we can pretty much perform automatically. Explicit memories, these are memories that require some conscious effort to produce. So for example, facts such as being able to name as many presidents as possible, or being able to spell the word photosynthesis, it requires some genuine effort. As well as personal experiences, like being able to think about the last time that you went fishing, or the last time, and who all was there, and how many fish you caught, and all the details associated with those personal experiences. Those memories are more explicit, and they require more cognitive effort. Those memories are much more heavily influenced by a brain structure known as the hippocampus. However, the hippocampus is very much underdeveloped in infancy, and that is why we struggle with remembering any of our personal experiences from infancy, and we describe that as infantile amnesia. There are some people that claim to have infantile memories. There are even some people that claim to have prenatal memories, although that is extremely, extremely rare. However, these are simply just claims, and so it's very difficult for them to validate them from a scientific standpoint. As we move through this course, more so in a general psychology class, but we will make reference to in this class, is that memory is a very, very unreliable cognitive ability that humans have. It's very easy to forget something. It's very easy to misremember something. It's very easy to imagine a personal experience that you're having, and then years later have those same images that you imagined come up in an effort to retrieve an actual memory. And so it's very difficult for a brain, for the mind, to be able to differentiate images that were truly actually experiences versus images that were conjured up by our imagination. In the moment, it's easy to understand that we are producing an image in our imagination, but once that image has been produced, there are some neuronal connections that are being established and formed, and so therefore that image can be reproduced years later, and there's no way to, with absolute certainty, determine or state that it's an actual memory or a false memory. Moving on to language development. Language development, in my opinion, and certainly is a shared opinion for many psychologists, is one of the most important developments of humans. Humans go through very similar stages of language development during the first year of life. We begin with physiological sounds during the first month of life, such as burping and crying. Around the second month of life, we begin to produce vowel-like sounds, such as which we describe as cooing. This is basically sounds like ooh and ah. And these sounds will continue until about the fourth or fifth month of life, when we begin to babble. And so babbling involves the combination of consonants and syllables. So for example, the basis of mama and dada, those are consonants. This is basic babbling. It's consonants and syllables. However, that actually has some meaning or some value to it. Those words do. The video that's attached there for babbling basically shows a lot of nonsensical sounds that are being produced, which is actually very good. There are some babies that do not produce much sounds during the first 6 months to 12 months of life, and that can be a major cause for concern, because that can be associated with delayed language development. We do expect humans to produce their first words around 12 months of life. And when humans learn when humans essentially begin to develop words, they begin to use those words in all sorts of inappropriate ways. And so, for example, an overextension is applying a word to objects that are inappropriate for the word's meaning. What does that mean? Well, the video that's attached there shows an infant, probably around 2 years of age, who is who does not have the word orange as part of their vocabulary. And so they are describing an orange as an apple, and they call it an apple repeatedly. They don't understand the difference between an orange and an apple. For them, the word apple might just mean round fruit that you eat. It might not necessarily be specifically tied to a red fruit. And so they might use the word apple to describe an orange. And then they might learn the word orange, and they might use that word to describe a grapefruit. And so this concept might sound familiar to you when we were talking about Jean Piaget's concept of assimilation, basically using the words or the ideas that we know to be able to describe new experiences or understand new experiences. They are very similar concepts, overextension and assimilation. The thing to keep in mind is that cognition, the ideas and the thinking that goes on in our head, is not the exact same thing as the language that we develop. Words and ideas are very, very closely associated with one another. They're very, very similar, but they are different. Sometimes we have an idea, but we don't have the word for it. Sometimes we don't understand what we are experiencing, and so we don't have the words for it. So they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. An underextension is applying a word too narrowly. So for example, maybe a child learns the word doggy, and they use that word to identify or describe the dog that lives in their home. And then one day they go out to a park and there's a dog there, and the parents ask the baby, what is that? Expecting the baby to say that it's a doggy. But in their mind, the word doggy might not necessarily apply to all dogs. To them, it's kind of like the name of the dog at home. That's the doggy is at home. The doggy that they're experiencing now isn't doggy. The doggy's at home, and so that would be an underextension. Of course, we eventually learned that the word doggy can be extended to or applied to all dogs, not just our dog. What comes soon after the use of single words is the combination of words, called telegraphic speech, being able to combine two words to communicate. There's a bunch of examples there: mommy milk, more milk, daddy home, give papa, and some of this stuff might not make sense to us on the receiving end of it, but it's important to understand that, these babies are basically using the words that they have to be able to try to communicate more complex ideas. Mommy milk might mean that mommy has milk, or they might be asking for more milk. Because they only have such few words, they're doing with what they can. What's important to understand is that language development is a lifelong process. And so, combining two words is the foundation for combining 3 words and 4 words, and writing complete sentences and writing complete paragraphs, and then combining paragraphs to write, several page-long essays. And so it's important to understand that it's a skill that takes decades and decades to master, and it's something that's always changing and always developing. It's also important to understand that much of our language development is going to determine our success in life. When you consider the standardized tests that are given to children, to determine their intelligence, or to determine whether or not they're going to be in advanced courses, or to determine the score that they're going to get on a test like the SAT or the ACT, which will likely determine the type of college they get into, or their ability to write a scholarship essay will determine whether or not they get the essay. It's important to understand that language development has huge ramifications on our general success in life. So, to understand language development a little bit more, we need to understand that it's a product of both biological abilities as well as environmental stimulation. It's a product of both nature and nurture. So we have a couple of arguments for nature. So humans share language-specific regions of the brain, and so all humans who basically produce language, we have these 2 language areas that are known as Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe where the motor cortex is. And so in order to produce language, we need to be able to move our lips and be able to move our vocal cords on command. And so it's important to understand that Broca's area is responsible for speech production, being able to produce words and produce sounds on command. Wernicke's area, which is located in the temporal lobe where the auditory cortex is, that's responsible for being able to comprehend language or understand language. And so that has a lot of auditory function associated with it. But we all have these same language areas of the brain. Obviously, as a lecturer, I'm relying more so on Broca's area, whereas a student who's listening to this, you're more relying on Wernicke's area in order to be able to understand what I'm saying. We looked a few slides ago that we saw that humans develop language in the same basic stages. We saw that humans, generate physiological sounds during the first 2 months of life and then begin to coo and then babble and then typically say their first word at the age of 12 months, at around 1 year of age. And so because humans of all different cultures and ethnicities and genders and eras, they all seem to develop language in these same basic stages, it's a strong argument for the idea that language is a natural or biological ability. Language development, however, is dependent on the quality and the quantity of environmental stimulation. I was giving you examples earlier about how we have these aptitude tests or academic tests that are used to measure language development, reading tests and writing tests. Well, I mean, understand that if you give a reading test or a writing test to a classroom of students, you are going to have a student who scores highest and you are going to have a student who scores lowest. And so why is that? Well, it might be biologically based, or it might be a result of the environmental stimulation that they've been received throughout their entire life. You know, when we discuss the quantity of environmental stimulation and you compare a child who is read to every single night during the first 3 or 4 years of life, and then they read a book every week, between the ages of 4 and 20, that's a lot of environmental stimulation compared to another child who is rarely ever read to, where reading is not a priority to them or in their household, and so they very rarely read books at all. That's very low quantity of environmental stimulation with regards to language development. So I think that it's safe to predict that the child that is exposed to a higher level of language stimulation, they're likely going to have more advanced language development. But it's not just the amount of environmental stimulation, it's also the quality of environmental stimulation. What kind of words are these children being exposed to? Children can learn language through simple conversation or through just listening to other people converse and other people talk. But if one child is being exposed to conversations from people who, or not just one child, but I'll just say a person is being exposed to, language that's being spoken by an educated individual with a high level of language development, whereas another person or child is only being exposed to language spoken by people with low language development, well, then that is going to essentially be a difference in the quality of language stimulation that they receive. So we just reviewed the different arguments for biological focuses or emphasis on language, and then the environmental or nurture component of language development. And that concludes cognitive development in infancy.